Dreams. Dreams have always been a mystery, an enigmatic crossroads between fiction and the reality of the waking world. Some say that every dream has a meaning, whether it be your teeth falling out in your dreams due to anxiety or stress, or a past family member showing up in a dream because you're mourning. Dreams can go from nice, calm, and pleasant to a psychedelic trip barely able to be comprehended by your mind, to a dark, terrifying scenario brought upon by your deepest fears, all purely depending on your mind and your emotions. However, there are some cases that I and many others believe cannot be explained by tying them to stress, fear, or grief. Things like your mind fabricating things that you thought you could never think of, whether it be a strange scenario that defies all logic, or a character beyond anything you could have possibly thought of at the time. The latter is our subject today. Hello everyone, my name is JR, and as most of you may have noticed, a while back I posted a video titled My Paranormal Experiences, in which I described and told of experiences I've had with ghosts. The response was surprisingly positive, so I've come back again to share another story. Now, let's begin, why don't we? There are numerous different types of dreams. Lucid dreams, fever dreams. Some even experience something I'd like to call a premonition dream, in which they dream of something happening before it actually happens. However, there is one type of dream I'd like to focus on, that being recurring dreams. Recurring dreams are dreams, or rather a dream, that for one reason or another rears its head on multiple separate occasions, usually for several nights in a row. Like all dreams, recurring dreams are thought to spawn due to something on the person's mind, whether that be regarding something like an anticipated event that is yet to come, or has already passed, or something more sinister, like a primal fear that haunts the victim. Whatever be the reason for their existence, it doesn't change the fact that recurring dreams are very much a thing. They also seem to be pretty common with a lot of people in the world, as if you type the word recurring into Google, the third result will be recurring dreams. While recurring dreams seem to be commonplace, there seems to be a less common variation of these dreams, where it isn't the dream scenario itself that occurs repeatedly, but rather a character. Ignoring obvious things like family members, some people have recurring characters in dreams that sometimes seem to be completely fabricated by the person's mind and are not even real people. This was my case. However, this wasn't just a man or a woman that always showed up in my dreams for around a month or so. It was something that, to this day, I cannot understand how my mind could have thought of something of its like, especially at the age I first started seeing it. The first time I can remember seeing this thing in my dreams was around age 3, and it continued to show up for the next 5 years, even in dreams it had no place in. As I grew older, I started to notice that if I were to actively look around in my dreams, I could always find this thing watching, looming, seemingly leering. Now, I know what many of you are thinking. If I'm actively looking for it while dreaming, it's obviously going to show up because I'm thinking about it. But when I say actively look around, I don't mean searching for the monster. I mean it in the sense that I'm looking around and taking in the details of my surroundings. An example would be if I'm dreaming that I'm in a forest, I would want to look around and see what I could find, whether it be a trail, signs of civilization, or simply enjoying the scenery. But I wouldn't be able to enjoy the scenery for long, as at some point, I would see the creature, staring back at me. Before we get into more of that, I should tell the story of the first dream I had of this creature. Keep in mind, as I tell you this, at the time of the dream, I was only 3 years old. I had never even grasped the concept of horror at all. All I knew at this point was I enjoyed Hot Wheels and Nickelodeon. I hadn't even stumbled across my parents watching a horror movie yet. I would like to preface this by saying this is not a creepypasta, nor is it an urban legend. Everything I tell you from this point on is from my own memory and experience. Now, on to the story. I remember waking up in the middle of a large corridor, like one you would find in a school, a hospital, or other building that usually has a large head count. The walls were lined with several doors on either side. Ahead of me, down the corridor, was a T-junction. One way leading to the right, another to the left, and the wall across from me was a row of windows that let in a dim, yellow-tinted light. Behind me was nothing but a pair of double doors that were sealed by a lock and chain connected through the push bars of each door. The windows of the doors were the kind of security glass with the cross patterns in them. Nothing coming in from the other side other than the same dim yellow light coming from the windows on the far wall. The walls, doors, and everything were only lit by the light that shone through both sets of windows, but it was enough to see that the floor was comprised of cracked, dirty tile, the wallpaper was moldy and peeling, and the doors along the two walls were seemingly metal, as they were almost completely covered in rust. No sound came from outside the building other than distant rolling thunder. After experiencing what was in this dream, at the age I did, it wouldn't be too far off to assume that this is where my fear of thunder came from. After some time had passed and I was sufficiently freaked out, I then heard approaching footsteps coming from the T-junction. Accompanying the footsteps was the faint sound of whispers, and something that sounded like if you were to tap a tile floor with a rock. I didn't know what to do, so I just sat there and watched the T-junction, waiting. As the footsteps and whispering grew louder, I soon saw a large, crescent-shaped blade-like object come out from the left-hand hall, followed by another, much lower, that swung forward and clacked onto the floor, point first, like an ice pick. This was followed by another, doing the same thing, but on the monster's left side. As it crept out from the hall it came from, into the center of the junction, I was able to get a much better look at the creature. The best way I could describe it would be to compare it to a clear skeleton from the game Serious Sam, but instead of a skull for a head, it had another larger scythe-like claw for a head, making it look like a pterodactyl's head, but with no mouth and much sharper. It also had the same bull-like horns that the clears have in Serious Sam 3. In addition, instead of it being skeletal, it was hairless, but it had flesh, and seemingly no or very little fat or muscle, making it look skinny and malnourished, giving it a very similar body type to the Native American legend of the Wendigo, which in itself is unsettling, as I live in a part of Oregon that is heavily influenced by Native American culture, folklore, and the like. The whispers were also seemingly coming from the monster, despite it having no visible mouth. As it reached the center of the junction, suddenly, it stopped, and looked at me. The whispers stopped for a moment, but soon resumed with a hint of aggravation behind them, akin to what it sounds like when you're angry at someone and you insult them under your breath. The monster then turned to face me and started creeping toward me. I didn't know what to do, and even if I did, I couldn't do it if I tried. I was frozen. After a bit, the monster started quickening its pace until it came to a full-out sprint, the whispers growing louder and more intense as the creature drew closer, the thunder outside doing the same. I don't remember the dream ending. All I can remember was waking up crying because of how scared I was. Like I said, I was 3 years old, so I didn't even understand the concept of dreams, and I thought I was just stuck alone with whatever the fuck that thing was. For the next 5 years, I never had a nightmare like that again, but, as I said before, If I were to look around, there was a 100% chance that that thing would be sitting somewhere. After time had passed, I decided to name it the Scythe. 5 years. 5 years worth of dreams, and the Scythe was in every single one of them. Even when I was having an extremely happy dream, the Scythe would be somewhere. In a window, behind a tree, or even just standing in the middle of an empty field. The worst part of all of this was what happened every time I saw it. No matter what, any time I locked my eyes on the Scythe, I could do nothing but freeze where I was and stare at it, completely petrified by either the Scythe itself or something much more powerful at hand. For 5 years, I was afraid to go to sleep at night due to the possibility of seeing that fucking thing again. It never did anything more than stand there and watch me, other than the first dream, but I believe its mere presence changed the way I am as a person for life. To this day, I attribute many of my negative aspects to the Scythe. My paranoia, stemming from the feeling of being watched that it brought. My insomnia, from the fear of going to sleep. My astrophobia, from the thunderstorm in the original dream. This thing had a lasting effect on me, which is why I think that this dream and this character were more than meets the eye. Beforehand, I had no uncontrollable urge to check behind me whenever I was alone. I loved to sleep, and I was fascinated by thunderstorms. But even now, I refuse to take the garbage out at night unarmed, and even when I do have a knife or something, I always hasten my pace when I'm going back inside, sometimes going into a full-out sprint. I have trouble going to sleep at night, and I have a fear of thunderstorms akin to what most people have of things like spiders, sharks, or open water. Along with all of that, if the Scythe was some sort of Wendigo, I always sleep with Native American dream catchers near my bed. Whatever this thing did, it changed the kind of person I was. Luckily, 5 years after the initial dream, I suddenly stopped seeing the Scythe in my dreams. However, I don't think this was without reason. 5 years after that dream marks the year I moved into the house I live in now. Beforehand, I lived in my old grandpa John's house that my mom inherited after he died. For the longest time, I loved that house, and I even cried when I found out that we were moving house. But the first night I slept in our new house, I didn't have a lingering tingling feeling down my spine like I did before. I didn't feel like I was being watched, and I never saw the Scythe. This persisted for weeks after that first night. I've now come to the conclusion that there was someone or something in that house that did not want us there. I may have cried when I found out we were moving back then, but now, as far as I'm concerned, I never want to see that fucking house again. I lived and slept in peace in our new house for a very long time, but for a couple months, I started having episodes. These episodes were brought on by an enigma known as sleep paralysis. If you don't know what sleep paralysis is, it's basically when your mind gets caught between the stages of being awake and falling asleep, and the REM stage of sleep, also known as deep sleep. In this state, the body is unable to move as it's essentially shut down, similar to how it is when you're fully asleep. But you can still open your eyes and see the real world around you. However, while the world around you is real, it is not uncommon that you will end up seeing things that are not actually there when you are stuck in sleep paralysis. Common things to see while sleep paralyzed are shadowy, featureless figures of various heights and body types, a man in a suit wearing a hat, usually something like a trilby, and an old hag. However, these are not the only things that can show up during sleep paralysis. For instance, one man who has suffered from sleep paralysis described seeing beings that have the same general shape of a generic gray alien, but their skin looked like what he described as television static and had large, cartoony, completely black smiles and eyes. If you want to learn more about sleep paralysis and hear more from the very man I just talked about, I highly recommend the 2015 film The Nightmare, which is what the background image is from. It is a really interesting watch, and it tells the stories of 8 different people who have suffered from sleep paralysis. It's on Netflix, so if you're interested, I highly suggest it. But, with that aside, it's true that I too suffered from sleep paralysis for a few months. Although, I never actually saw anything scary, but I did always have an underlying feeling of dread, and had the feeling of being watched, along with a tingling up my spine. However, the first night this happened, I opened my eyes to see that my door was cracked open slightly, even though I didn't leave it open when I went to bed. I wanted to get up and close it again, but I couldn't move, and even if I could, my brain was in fight or flight mode because someone, or something, was behind that door. And when I tried to avert my eyes and try to ignore it, I couldn't help but stare, as a familiar crescent-shaped claw reached around the edge of my door.